اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير الأعمال حي على خير الأعمال الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد خوشنودی امامی زمان علیہ السلام آواز بلند صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. محمد وآل محمد آواز بلند صلوات
Recite a salawat, please. Thank you. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين الذي بعد فلا يرى وقرب فشهد النجوى نحمده ونستعينه ونثني عليه ونؤمن به ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف بريته ومبلغ رسالاته العبد المؤيد الرسول المسدد المحمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعجل فرجه وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين عباد الله أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله. We begin today's khutbah by reminding all of us, including myself, to be fearful and to be wary and pay attention to the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like we were discussing in the previous weeks, we will move on to the discussion that Imam Khomeini begins on the topic of al-qadhab. Recite a salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. We'll continue our discussion with the topic that Imam al-Khomeini now moves on to, and that is the topic of al-qadhab. He starts out with a hadith from the book of Al-Kafi. We've touched on this idea before of why Imam al-Khomeini keeps going to the book of Al-Kafi. And we mentioned there's a reason for it. There's a theological reason, and one that's deeply rooted in the way we understand our religion. It's a very lengthy topic. I can't go into it right now. But what I will say is that we have to be very careful where we narrate hadith from. I've mentioned this before many times. I will mention it many times in the future as well, because this is an issue that we have within our communities. That anyone thinks that they can just grab a hadith from here, grab a hadith from there. This hadith says if you do this act of worship, for example, is this much reward for it. Or if you do this act of worship, there's no punishment for you at all. These ahadith, they have to be understood within a context. Some of them are, ahadith that are, reliable. We can validate them. Some of them are not reliable ahadith. There's a lot to be said about this. There's a whole science that deals with this issue, and that is the science of hadith. I say this because a lot of times, especially when the special months of Ramadan come around, Muharram comes around, Rajab comes around, Sha'ban comes around, and so on and so forth, or even special days within these months come around, you will find a flurry of hadith being shared left and right. And many times when you look into these ahadith, you find that, for example, this hadith is coming from a book that is not the most reliable book. Doesn't mean you can say for sure the Imam didn't say this. At the same time, you can't say for sure a lot of times that the Imam did say this. It's a longer discussion for another time. This is why Imam al-Khomeini begins this discussion with the book of Al-Kafi. He starts out and it says, Al-Imam al-Sadiq, salawatullahi alayhi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, is narrated to have said the following, Al-Ghadabu miftahu kulli shar. He says, anger is the key to all evil. This is a very important hadith that the Imam is mentioning. Anger is the key to all evil. Of course, there's evil that doesn't necessarily come from anger, but there's so much evil that does come from anger that it permits the Imam to make this generalization. It's almost as if anything that evil that happens in this world, it comes from what? It comes from this anger. Al-Ghadabu miftahu kulli shay. So Imam Khomeini, he starts to miftahu kulli shar. He starts to discuss this idea and this concept of anger and wrath. And he says fundamentally, it's not a bad thing. This is a characteristic that needs to be there within the human being. It comes from that aspect of the human being that we call quwwa qadhabiyya. It's an aspect of the character of the human being that is necessary, because sometimes the human being, he needs to be firm. Sometimes he needs to be rough in his approach. He needs to be tough in his approach. Discipline comes from this. If you go back to the root of it, someone wants to be disciplined in their life, it comes to this quwwa of theirs, this aspect of their character. If someone wants to defend themselves, it comes back to this quwwa. He has to feel that seriousness within himself to be able to defend himself, to be able to defend his family. When he looks at the enemies of Allah, it's this anger that boils up inside of him. Otherwise, if he didn't have this anger, he's going to be friends with anybody and everybody. Then he's not going to be able to practice this religion at all. So he says fundamentally this is not a bad thing. This is why we read in verse 29 of Surah Al-Fath, this verse of the Quran that describes for us the situation of the ashab of the Prophet. What did the ashab of the Prophet look like? In the month of Ramadan, we discussed this verse of the Quran as well. He says, Muhammadun Rasulullah. Recite a salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil faraj. Muhammadun Rasulullah, Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, وَالَّذِينَ مَعَهُ, and those who are with him, أَشِدَّاءُ عَلَى الْكُفَّارِ. When it comes to those who knowingly have turned away from the truth, they are firm. Al-Kuffar for us has one meaning. Al-Kuffar during the time of the Prophet had a different meaning. Al-Kuffar during the time of the Prophet, they saw the Prophet walking in front of them. Yes, the signs of God were in front of them. And if they turned away from the faith at that point, this is a person who's seeing the truth and he is turning away from the truth. Yes. He says they are firm with the kuffar. What does that mean? Does that mean they have bad akhlaq? Does that mean that they are constantly frowning? No, it means that they make their path separate from the path of the kuffar. They are not friends with anybody and everybody in the sense that associating themselves with anybody and everybody. No, they were kuffar who wanted to kill all the Muslims. And the Quran says you have to separate your paths from these individuals. And this is a historical discussion, of course, because these kuffar that we talk about, they were not strangers to the Muslims. Many of them were relatives of the Muslims. They all came from Quraysh. And our Prophet came from Quraysh as well. I've mentioned this, the Abu Sufyans of the world and the Muawiyahs of the world, and they were all related to the Prophet one way or another. Yes, further distant relatives. Yes, they weren't from Bani Hashim, but they were still related to the Prophet. These were not strangers. So Imam al-Khomeini, he says it's important for this believer to have this characteristic within him. But the problem is when he doesn't control it. The problem is when he uses this characteristic when it is not to be used. That's where the problem begins. And this is where he moves on to the second hadith, again also from Imam al-Sadiq, salawatullahi alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. He narrates that the Prophet had said, Al-ghadabu yufsidul iman, anger ruins one's faith, kama yufsidul khal al-asal. The way when you place vinegar in honey, the structure of this honey starts to fall apart. You know, they're completely in contrast with one another. This is sour, that's sweet, yes? And you put a drop of this vinegar in this sweet honey, the structure of this honey starts to fall apart. It starts to dissolve. Yes? The same way this vinegar dissolves gets rid of this honey. It ruins the structure of this honey. He says anger does the same thing to the faith of the believer. All you need is a drop of it. All you need is a little bit of it. A little bit, when I say a little bit, I mean like in an excessive manner, a little bit of it. 2 moments where you're too angry to control yourself. That's all it takes. This is the reality of the matter. And he's going to talk about this. Yes? And then he continues. He says, what hadith tells us is that anger that you feel in that moment, if it's the wrong type of anger towards the wrong person, yes? Sometimes you have anger towards an oppressor. Okay, this is what you're supposed to have, yes? Sometimes you have anger towards someone who's oppressed. This is possible. Sometimes in our households, this is what happens. And I don't want to go into the issues that we have in our communities, but this is real issues that we talk about, yes? These domestic violence, things of that nature that are very real and happen, unfortunately. Sometimes you're angry at who? At the person who is oppressed. It's possible. If one doesn't control his anger, that's where he ends up. He says this anger that you feel when it is not appropriate, meaning it's a haram type of anger. Yes, it's a type of anger that's putting you out of bounds with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says hadith tells us that this anger is directly connected and correlates with the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you manifest this anger, He will manifest His anger upon you. And when you hold back your anger, He will hold back His anger when it comes to you. And this has to do with another topic, and that is the punishment of hellfire. And our deeds are not two separate things. They are the same. They're just two different manifestations. One is a physical manifestation. I yell at someone, na'udhu billah, yes. I hurt someone, na'udhu billah. And then the spiritual manifestation of it shows itself in the next world in the form of a punishment. But they're the same thing. Multiple verses of the Quran share this with us. Multiple ahadith share this with us, including this. That anywhere you go in hadith, the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is tied to the anger that you show, if it's inappropriate. And the more you hold back that anger, hadith says he will hold back his anger when it comes to you. So it's a very beautiful hadith. If I'm not mistaken, this is mentioned in Al-Khisal of Shaykh al-Saduq, one of our earlier sources. Imam al-Rida, salawatullahi alayhi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. He is narrating that Isa alayhi salam had this conversation with his Hawariyun. Who were his Hawariyun? These were the special companions of Isa alayhi salam. Some have even said, some scholars, that they were prophets in and of themselves. Different opinions, but they were high-ranking, at the very least, companions of Isa alayhi salam. And they used to sit around him and learn from his wisdom. And in one of these conversations, there's multiple of these conversations narrated in hadith for us. In one of these, قال الحواريون لعيسى, they turned to Isa alayhi salam. They said, Ya muallim al-khair, O teacher of ours. You know, when students sit around the wise man, yes? And they say, Master, tell us, share from your wisdom with us. Ya muallim al-khair, أعلمنا أي الأشياء أشد. What is there in the world that is the most severe, the harshest of things in the world? It's an interesting question. It's the harshest thing in the world. قال أشد الأشياء. He said the harshest thing that you will ever come across, غضب الله, is the wrath and the anger of Allah. That's the harshest thing. That when it applies to someone, it's very difficult to deal with. And then they asked a very beautiful question. This conversation they're having with Isa alayhi salam. قالوا فبما فيما يتقى غضب الله. So what are we supposed to do to protect ourselves from the anger of God, from the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What are we supposed to do then? You know what Isa alayhi salam said? قال بأن لا تغضبوا. You will avoid his anger by making sure that you do not manifest anger towards others. The more you hold back your own anger, when it's inappropriate to show anger, yes? The more Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala holds back his anger when it comes to you. Multiple ahadith, they talk about this point. And this goes deeper because your anger, or rather the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the Day of Judgment, is a manifestation of your anger. It's directly connected to one another, directly correlating with one another. They said, فَفِيمَا يُتَّقَى غَضَبُ اللَّهِ قَالَ بِأَنْ لَا تَغْضَبُوا. And then the conversation continues, yes? And this is why, again narrated in another hadith, that Imam al-Sadiq, salawatullahi alayhi, he says, يقول إن في التوراة مكتوبا. It is written in the Torah. Which Torah? This Torah that we hear of today, the Jewish Torah? No, the Jewish Torah. In fact, what we call the Torah, what the Quran calls the Torah, and what the Jewish faith calls the Torah, completely different things. Yes? The Quran calls the Torah, it's the whole book of Musa alayhi salam. In the Jewish faith today, a portion of that book is referred to as the Torah. It's a longer discussion for another time. Nonetheless, in that true Torah, إِنَّ فِي التَّوْرَاتِ مَكْتُوبًا يَبْنَ آدَمَ, O son of Adam, اذْكُرْنِي حِينَ تَغْضَبْ. Remember me when that anger starts to boil up inside of you, when it's inappropriate, yes? When it comes to your loved ones, for example. When you're going to say something to hurt this person. God forbid, physically. Yes? اذْكُرْنِي حِينَ تَغْضَبْ. Remember me when you become angry. Why? What's going to happen if I remember you? أَذْكُرُكَ عِنْدَ غَضَبِي. Because when you come to me on the Day of Judgment and you are worthy of my anger and wrath, I will remember you. Because you remembered me and you held back your anger. I will remember you in that moment. When you need my mercy the most, that's what I'm going to look at. Were you merciful towards others or not? We've heard this hadith before, yes? That the Prophet used to kiss his children, his grandchildren. He used to kiss Imam al-Hussein, salawatullahi alayhi. And one of the Arab of that time, one of the people of that time, he looked at the Prophet, he said, this is not how we do things. We don't show affection to our children like this. We don't hug them, we don't kiss them, This is not the way a grown man, this is my rewarding of the hadith, of course. This is not a way a grown man is supposed to be acting. This is weak. And the Prophet said, I don't know what to tell you. I will just tell you this. Man la yarham, la yurham. The one who doesn't show mercy, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not show mercy to him. No, you're supposed to show affection. That's a topic for another time as well. The type of relationship that our parents have with our children. We look at it simply as a little bit of affection. For that child, it's his whole world. When he gets older, he becomes a youth, he becomes a grown man himself, he looks back on and relies on the affection that he used to receive from his parents. And if it's lacking, there will be things that will be lacking in his life as an adult even. It will affect his career. It will affect even the relationship at times that he has with his spouse, because this is the way he's seen affection. I'm not supposed to show affection. No, it's just, I told you once I love you. That's it. That's for the rest of your life, that's enough. That's not the way it works, yes? It's because when he was a child, or when she was a child, it can go any way, yes? Sometimes that becomes a problem. Yabna Adam, udhkurni hina taqdab. Remember me when you are angry. Adhkuruka inda qadabi. I will remember you when it's time for my anger. Fala amhaquka fi man amhaq. I will not punish you amongst those that I will punish, because you did not punish others while you were alive. You had mercy towards others who were alive. وَإِذَا ظَلَمْتَ بِمَظْلَمَةٍ. And when injustice is done to you, look at this line. When injustice is done to you, فَرْضَ بِانْتِصَارِ لَكَ. Be pleased. You should do whatever you can do to take back your rights. But at the end of the day, be pleased with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in mind for you. Know that He is the one who will take back justice for you. Whether it happens in this world, it doesn't happen in this world, He's watching. And that person will pay. And that person will be held accountable. If it's in this world, in this world. If it's not in this world, the time will come. فَرْضَ بِانْتِصَارِ لَكَ فَإِنَّ انْتِصَارِ لَكَ خَيْرٌ مِّنْ انْتِصَارِكَ لِنَفْسِكَ. Rely on me, because I can get back justice for you better than you can do it for yourself. You're angry because you want to get justice back, yes? No problem. You take the steps to get your rights back. You should do that. And sometimes it's wajib to do that. But deep down you understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing His own work. If you get the results, great. If you don't get the results, know that there's someone else who's looking for justice for you. These are multiple implications. We don't have time to go into those. Now, Imam al-Khuwaini moves on. He says the problem with this qadab is that it's not just something that ruins your day. Yes, anger isn't just something that you woke up, it's a wonderful day, but because you're angry, the whole day becomes ruined. That's not the only problem with it. He says it leads to so many other sins. And that is what we'll leave, inshallah, for the next session. What are these sins that anger leads to? And after that, Imam al-Khuwaini then starts to talk about the ilaj and what am I supposed to do if I have this problem of anger within me. The problem is, though, there's no pill you can take for it. And go to sleep at night and wake up and the next morning it's not there anymore. Unfortunately, that's not how it works, but there are ways to work on it. With that, inshallah, we'll bring the first khutbah to an end. A'udhu billah minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Qul huwa Allahu ahad, Allahu as-samad. Lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakun lahu kufuwan ahad. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين أثني عليه حامدا وأذكره مسبحا ثم أصلي وأسلم على نجيبه وجليله وحافظ سره الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأراضين بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل وسلم على علي أمير المؤمنين وفاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين وعلى سبطي نبي الرحمة وإمامي الهدى الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة وعلى علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والخلف الهادي المهدي حججك على عبادك وأمنائك في أرضك صلوات اللهم صل على محمد فرجا اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات عباد الله أوصيكم بتقوى الله. We begin the second khutbah by reminding ourselves to be weary and aware of the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll continue with the tafsir of Surah Al-Hadid, in which we came down to verse number 10. وَمَا لَكُمْ أَلَّا تُنْفِقُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. If you remember, Surah Al-Hadid is one of those surahs, it's amongst the Surah Al-Musabbihat, starts with Sabbaha. And in it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the main themes of the surah is the financial contributions of the mu'mineen. At least when it is wajib for them to do so, at the very least. وَمَا لَكُمْ أَلَّا تُنْفِقُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَلِلَّهِ مِيرَاثُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Why is it that you do not give in the path of Allah? وَلِلَّهِ مِيرَاثُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. While for Him belongs, or to Him belongs, the inheritance of the heavens and the earth. Meaning that this wealth was not yours, someone else's wealth. He passed it along to you to begin with. لا يستوي منكم من أنفق من قبل الفتح وقاتل. Those of you who gave before al-Fath, before the Fath of Mecca, according to one opinion, and those of you who fought before that time, they are not the same as those who did so afterwards. Because before al-Fath and after al-Fath are two completely different stories altogether. When you look into history, the 8th year after Hijrah, the Prophet was able to do what? To go back to Mecca. Yes? Just such a critical historical event. When he went there, then all of the Arabian Peninsula now was in the hands of the Prophet. Because you have two main cities in this Arabian Peninsula. Outside of Yemen, there's Mecca and Medina. Medina he already had. Now he's coming back. He's taking back Mecca. Now people, يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. People are coming into the religion in masses. Hundreds, thousands maybe. He says, those who used to be there for the Prophet before this happened, what they were doing was special. Yes, those who come afterwards as well, no problem. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards them as well. But it's very different when you do something when it's not popular. It's very different when you do something while others are not doing it. But you do it because you know it's your duty. And we said amongst the characteristics of the munafiqeen, and I mentioned not to say that if I do this, I am munafiq. No, the inclinations that the munafiqeen have, the tendencies that the munafiqeen have, one of them is this. They sit back and they wait for others to go ahead. Even though they know it's their duty to move ahead. No, they sit back, they wait for others. Then when others go, if they fail, they say, see, we told you, you shouldn't have gone. If they go, they're victorious, then they say, yeah, we're together. This is the tendency of the munafiqeen. This is something that I have to be careful of. All of us have to be careful of. He says, أُولَٰئِكَ أَعْظَمُ دَرَجَةً مِّنَ الَّذِينَ أَنفَقُوا مِن بَعْدُ وَقَاتَلُوا. Their reward is going to be much greater than those who gave from their wealth and fought in His path after al-Fath. وَكُلًّا وَعَدَ اللَّهُ الْحُسْنَى. Both of them we will reward. وَاللَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ خَبِيرٌ. But Allah knows exactly what you're doing. It might look the same on the surface, but in reality, it was not the same. And in other verses of the Quran, we read this as well. That the people of the time of the Prophet, because now they were all part of this ummah, they say, yes, we're all part of the ummah of the Prophet. And the Quran says, yes, you're all part of one ummah, but from my perspective, there are differences between you. And in one historical incident that took place, Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, and Shayba, another person, who were respectively in charge of bringing water to the Hujjaj in Mecca. This was the role of Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet. Historically, his family had this role. And Shayba, who was in charge of fixing and taking care of the Kaaba itself. They used to sit there and they used to be proud. They used to boast. We are the ones who serve the Hujjaj. And we are the ones that when this Baytullah al-Haram becomes, there's something wrong with it, we're the ones who fix it. And look at what the Quran said. This is great. You're bringing water to the Hujjaj. Wonderful. But he said, أَجَعَلْتُمْ سِقَايَةَ الْحَاجِ وَعِمَارَةَ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ كَمَنْ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخَرِ وَجَاهَدَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. And the narration says that when they were boasting, Ali ibn Abi Talib came upon them. And he said, listen, you guys are doing this. This is great. But you are not to equate this with those who went and put their lives on the line. And according to one narration, Ali ibn Abi Talib said, you entered into this faith because I went into the battlefield. And the Quran says you are putting siqayat al-hajj, bringing water to the Hujjaj, which is great, it's wonderful. You're putting this on the same level as the one who's sacrificing and giving his wealth and life in my path. Not the same. أَجَعَلْتُمْ سِقَايَةَ الْحَاجِ وَعِمَارَةَ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ. Not the same. لَا يَسْتَوُونَ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ لَا يَهْدِي الْقَوْمَ الظَّالِمِينَ. This is not the same for me. There are many implications, many lessons to be learned from this. And I'll say this for the younger guys who are here. It may not be popular for you to practice your religion fully. But that's exactly why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you much more. Sometimes, the elders will forgive me, sometimes even more than the elders or your parents, who might have grown up in a society where practicing the religion to a certain degree was accepted. Sometimes your reward might even be greater. I hope that's okay with the elders. Moving on. مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يُقْرِضُ اللَّهَ قَرْضًا حَسَنًا. Who is it that will give a loan to Allah, a wonderful loan, so that He will take this loan فَيُضَاعِفَهُ لَهُ وَلَهُ أَجْرٌ كَرِيمٌ. He will take this loan and He will multiply it. And for this person will be a wonderful reward, an honorable reward. What is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking about when He says, give me a loan? He means, you give money in His path, of course. But this verse has a number of beautiful points. Number one, most important point, which He had mentioned a couple verses ago. Multiple times He mentioned this a couple verses ago. He says, who is it that will loan his wealth to Allah? It is only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the whole wide world who will give you wealth and then act as if this was your wealth to begin with. And then He will say, will you give me a loan? It's not your wealth. He just said, وَأَنْفِقُوا مِمَّا جَعَلَكُمْ مُسْتَخْلَفِينَ فِيهِ. Give from those things that used to be someone else's, now we gave to you. But because He wants to give this importance to you, because He wants you to walk away with the reward, He says, you know what? Let's just act like this is your money. Will you give Allah a loan, please? Only He will do this. No one else does that in this world. If someone else gives you money, He says, listen, this was my money. Yes? I'm not asking for a loan. I'm not asking for a favor. This is my money. No, He will give you wealth and then He say, let's just act like it was yours. Will you give me a little bit of your money as a loan? Why? Because I want you in the midst of this process to walk away with a reward. I want to give you a big reward. But in order to do so, we have to act like this is your money and you're giving from your own money. Imagine if a father came to a son, a 5-year-old, 10-year-old, and said, this is your money. And then he walked away, and then later he came, he said, can you help Baba? Baba needs a little bit of money. Testing his child. And this child says, yes. You've seen younger children say, yes, I will give to Baba. Well, who gave you this money? No, let's just act like it's his. Because in this, we want him to grow spiritually. We want his character to grow. He says, مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يُقْرِضُ اللَّهَ قَرْضًا. Who is it that will give Allah a loan? God forbid, na'udhu billah. If someone did not know, they would have assumed the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is phrasing this word, this line, almost as if He doesn't have anything. Almost as if He's not the owner of everything. No, He says, let's act like it's yours. But now give it back to me. In this process, you will grow and I will have a great reward for you. Number one. Number two, He says that I will take this wealth of yours, I will multiply it for you. You're not losing anything. I'm going to take it. I'm going to do some work with it. When they take a loan from you, normally, they take a loan from you, they come back, they give you the same money. I don't give you anything extra. He says, I will multiply it. But the interesting thing is, the Quran in different incidents, different verses, will tell you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala multiplies the wealth by different numbers. Here he says, فَيُضَاعِفَهُ. He will multiply it. By how many times? What's my ROI? What's the rate of return that I'm going to get on this? Yes? You know, many of us are wondering, is this better return than crypto? I have to make sure, you know? He just says, فَيُضَاعِفَهُ. But then in other verses of the Quran, he says, no, ضِعْفَيْن. Multiplied by 2. In other verses of the Quran, he says, no, you do one deed, I will give you how much? 10 in return. In some verses of the Quran, as in the case of Surah Al-Baqarah, he says, no, مَثَلُ الَّذِينَ يُنْفِقُونَ أَمْوَالَهُم فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. When you give in the path of Allah, كَمَثَلِ حَبَّةٍ. It's like a seed. أَنْبَتَتْ سَبْعَ سَنَابِلٍ. It blossoms 7 times. فِي كُلِّ سُنْبُلَةٍ. Every time it blossoms, مِئَةُ حَبَّةٍ. Every time it blossoms, within that blossom, you will find 100 seeds of its own. This verse is saying 700. 700 times multiplication. Yes, if that. It seems to be denoting even more. So what is it at the end of the day? I mean, I don't get it. Is it once? Is it twice? Why don't you just tell us, I'm going to multiply it by 3. I'm going to multiply it by 4. Why? Because the multiplication of whatever it is that you do, whether it's infaq or other things, it depends on the depth of your faith. For some people, when they give 1, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala multiplies it by 700. For some people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala multiplies it by 100. For some people, by 10. It just depends on your faith. Yes, if you are Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi alayhi, if you're like him, then yes. That's why, based on some narrations, Hadith says, ضَرْبَةُ عَلِيٍّ يَوْمَ الْخَنْدَقِ. The fighting of Ali, the striking of the sword of Ali on that day, it's better than the ibadah of what? Of everyone. Why? Because he struck the sword more than anybody else in the world? No. He had a limited amount of life, yes? He didn't live for 2,000 years. It's because every time he used his sword, the faith and the sincerity was so deep that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala multiplies. The Quran says, just depends on, I'll multiply it for you, but how much? Depends on who you are. You give with full sincerity, I will multiply it to the max. You give with a little less, to that extent. But I'm going to multiply it either way. Because the Quran says, and with this inshallah I'll bring this khutbah to an end. There's a couple more points, beautiful points to discuss regarding this verse. We'll leave it for next week. Regardless of whatever it is that you do, the good that you do to others, it doesn't go unnoticed. Because when you go to the next verse says this. This is verse 262 from Surah Al-Baqarah. الَّذِينَ يُنْفِقُونَ أَمْوَالَهُمْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. Those people that we were talking about, they gave their wealth in the path of Allah. We said we multiply by 700 and whatnot. Here's the one thing. ثُمَّ لَا يُتْبِعُونَ مَا أَنفَقُوا مَنًّا وَلَا أَذَى. When they give in the path of Allah, and then they don't ruin it by bothering others, by creating problems for others. Sometimes you come across a person who's very generous, but he has 120 other issues. He helps you out here and then creates a whole lot of other pain for you otherwise. The Quran says if he doesn't ruin it, yes? What are you going to do? لَهُمْ أَجْرُهُمْ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ. They will have their reward. Okay, so what does this reward look like? This one line is more than enough. It's more than enough. I mean, leave the numbers aside. Just this one line is more than enough. He says, لَهُمْ أَجْرُهُمْ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ وَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. They have nothing to worry about. What else do you want? You know? You and I were bogged down in these numbers. How much am I going to get back? He says, لَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. You know how big of a claim that is? You know this, they say, يَوْمُ الْقِيَامَةِ يَوْمُ الْحَسْرَةِ يَوْمُ التَّغَابُونَ. It's the day everyone is running for their lives, yes? And everyone doesn't even care about their loved ones in the sense that they're more worried about themselves than they are about anybody else. And the fake friendships that they had in this world, it all falls apart. The fake friendships, not the real ones, the fake ones. On that day, he says, no, some people, لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. Have nothing to worry about. I thought Qiyamah is scary. It's not scary for everybody. It depends. If you gave it ahead and gave it forward, as they say, no, لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. So regardless of whatever I'm getting back, because the reality is I don't know the depth of my faith. Maybe I give in the path of Allah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for someone like me doesn't even accept it, you know. He says, no, you have other problems you have to worry about. Regardless of what I get back or I don't get back, the Quran is saying, وَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. We will take away from his worry on that day. Why? Because he took away from the worries of my servants when he had the opportunity to do so. There's a couple more points regarding this verse that are just very interesting. We'll leave that inshallah for next week. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. اللهم صل على الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله على محمد أشهد أن عليا حجة الله صلى الله على محمد حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. يا محسن قد أتاك المسيء أنت المحسن وأنا المسيء فتجاوز عن قبيح ما عندنا بجميل ما عندك يا كريم. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض الملك القدوس العزيز الحكيم هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين وآخرين منهم لما يلحقوا بهم وهو العزيز الحكيم ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا بئس مثل القوم الذين كذبوا بآيات الله والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. قل يا أيها الذين هادوا إن زعمتم أنكم أولياء لله من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين ولا يتمنونه أبدا بما قدمت أيديهم والله عليم بالظالمين. قل إن الموت الذي تفرون منه فإنه ملاقيكم ثم تردون إلى عالم الغيب والشهادة فينبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. فإذا قضيت الصلاة فانتشروا في الأرض وابتغوا من فضل الله واذكروا الله كثيرا لعلكم تفلحون. وإذا رأوا تجارة أو لهوا انفضوا إليها وتركوك قائما قل ما عند الله خير من اللهو ومن التجارة والله خير الرازقين. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. بسم الله وبالله الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله. تصبيحات منتظرة. السلام عليكم.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أستغفر الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم ذو الجلال والإكرام وأتوب إليه. يا الله يا رحمن يا رحيم يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على دينك. Brothers and sisters, the request for dua is ahead. Let's recite 5 times the Yujib. May Allah give shafa to all mu'mineen, especially mu'mineen who are requested for dua is ahead, especially mother of brother Asad Jafri. She is in ICU. May Allah give shafa inshallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. 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 أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه يكشف السوء برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. الله.
Bar Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat. Mu'min, please recite Surah Fatiha for all the Mu'min of the Mu'minin and Mu'minat. They are present here, especially Mu'min of Dr. Kazalbash, the family who brought the tabarruk today. Please recite Fatiha with a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Requesting Brother Muhammad to come to the mic to make a brief announcement. Please welcome Brother Muhammad with a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for coming out today. So the announcements for this week are tomorrow on Saturday, June 19th at 8 p.m. We're hosting a birth celebration of the 8th Imam, Ali ibn Musa al-Rida. The topic of the celebration will be barakah. What is it and how to attain it? And the program will start at 8 p.m. with recitation of Quran and poetry, followed by a speech by Sheikh Mehdi. And it will conclude with Maghrib Salat. And if you would like to donate to the Niyaz, please talk to Mazhar Abbas. And Tabarak will be served after the Maghrib Salat. Our weekly programs include Thursday night Salat Maghrib, followed by Hadith lecture and Dua Kumal. Jumat Salat will always be hosted on Fridays with a khutbah, and we hope to see you all at the programs. Thank you.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أشهد أن عليا حجة الله صلى الله عليه وسلم حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الله أكبر بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الله أكبر اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد، وتقبل شفاعته وارفع درجته. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. بسم الله وبالله الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
اللهم صل
على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل
على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله. تسبيحات منتظرة. السلام عليكم.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، واستغفر الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم الرحمن الرحيم ذو الجلال والإكرام وأتوب إليه. Inshallah, I recite Dua Wahdat all together. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لا إله إلا الله إلها واحدا ونحن له مسلمون. لا إله إلا الله ولا نعبد إلا إياه مخلصين له الدين ولو كره المشركون لا إله إلا الله ربنا ورب آبائنا الأولين لا إله إلا الله وحده وحده أنجز وعدا ونصر عبدا وعز جنده وهزم الأحزاب وحده وله الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت ويحيي وهو حي لا يموت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا حبيب الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين، السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى، السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا صاحب العصر والزمان، السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن، السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليكم يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم